So given that our skin is our most superficial organ, it is perhaps no surprise that it is the most vulnerable of our organ systems. But as we'll see, it's very well defended against things like chemical, physical, and biological attacks from microorganisms like fungi and bacteria. So kind of first and foremost, the skin is protecting the deeper tissues, the deeper connective tissues, the skeletal muscle, the bones, and certainly the visceral organs as well. But the skin also acts as a chemical barrier because it produces acidic secretions, and these acidic secretions create an acidic coating that's called the acid mantle. And the acid mantle helps to reduce the growth of bacteria on the surface of our skin. The skin also produces a pigment called melanin, and this pigment acts to shield our skin cells from a type of light called ultraviolet light that is produced by the sun. Now, ultraviolet light, it causes sunburns, and with enough exposure, it can cause skin cancer, or it can lead to skin cancer. And so in those two ways, producing the acidic secretions of the acid mantle and producing the pigment melanin, the skin acts as a chemical barrier. Right. So the skin also acts as a physical barrier because the epidermal cells are essentially continuous with one another. That is, the cells of the epidermis are locked together as a single sheet, and so they behave as one continuous structure that acts as a physical barrier to keep things out of our body. And these cells are also reinforced with a fibrous protein that's called keratin, and keratin gives them really great strength that helps those epidermal cells resist tearing and things like that. The skin also acts as a biological barrier that defends us against microorganisms. So the acid mantle that we talked about with the chemical barrier helps prevent bacterial growth, or at least reduce bacterial growth on the surface of the skin. And it also acts as a biological barrier because we have a couple of different cell types that are within the skin. We have the dendritic cells of the epidermis and the dermal macrophages that are found in the deeper layers of the dermis. And these are both cells, the dendritic cells and the dermal macrophages, are both cells that belong to the immune system. And so as such, they function to destroy pathogens like bacteria or fungi that enter the body through the skin. The skin also serves to regulate body temperature by really in kind of a couple of ways here. First, by making use of its sweat glands. And the skin can also control or regulate body temperature by dilating or constricting the blood vessels that are located within the dermis of the skin. The sweat glands act to cool our body by evaporative cooling, so that is, the sweat evaporates off of our skin, and that draws heat away from the body because that act of evaporation takes heat energy with it as it does that, and so that absorbs some of the heat energy and removes it from our body. And the blood vessel dilation helps to do one of two things. It can blood vessel dilation can help dump excess heat from the body. But also blood vessel constriction can work to conserve body heat when we're cold, and so we can see how this works here. So when we are warm, we've got blood vessels in the dermis, but not the epidermis, because remember, epidermis is epithelial tissue. And recall from chapter 4 that epithelial tissues never have blood vessels within them. But the connective tissues underneath do have blood vessels within them, and so that's what we see in the dermis here. So when our body is warm, dermal blood vessels tend to dilate, and this dilation helps to dump any excess body heat across the skin and out of the body. So that way our skin, and by virtue of the surface area of the skin, helps us lose excess body heat when we need to get rid of it. On the other hand, though, when we are cold, dermal blood vessels tend to constrict. And what this does is it helps to preserve our core body temperature and prevent really any unnecessary heat loss in cold environments. So we've seen that the skin acts in the regulation of body temperature. Kind of back to these other functions here, we see that the skin also acts in cutaneous sensation. So that is, the skin has a rich supply of cutaneous sensory receptors, and these are actually part of the nervous system. And let's take a look at those for a second here. So the skin is capable of detecting a variety of stimuli using several different cutaneous sensory receptors here. So we have tactile corpuscles that are located in the dermis, and these tactile corpuscles allow feelings of light touch. So that is, these tactile corpuscles, the skin doesn't need to be touched very hard in order for these tactile corpuscles to be able to detect that. Lamellar corpuscles, on the other hand, are located in the deeper parts of the dermis, and these tend to detect pressure because they're located in the deeper dermis. They're not as sensitive to light touch, but rather they're pressure sensitive, and so we're talking about sudden changes in pressure, so that is very abrupt pushes of pressure on the skin and things like that, and very deep pressure as well, and so lamellar corpuscles can detect that. Our hair follicle receptors, as their name implies, are associated with body hairs, and so they detect movement of the hairs on our skin. And so our skin has generally all over it, with the exception of our scalp and a few other places in our body, the skin has a very elaborate network of very fine hairs on it, and those hairs act as sensory receptors. If something like a small insect is crawling on our skin, then it moves the hairs, and we can detect that, and we can be alerted to the fact that there is something on us. We also see free nerve endings, which are really, as their name implies, these are just the dendrites of sensory neurons that detect a variety of stimuli here, like heat, cold, irritating chemicals, things like itching and things like that, and also a number of painful stimuli as well. So we've seen that the skin acts in cutaneous sensation, but the skin also has several metabolic functions as well. And so a few of the metabolic functions that the skin has is that the skin manufactures vitamin D precursors from modified cholesterol molecules. And the conversion of vitamin D precursors, from the conversion of these modified cholesterol molecules to pre-vitamin D occurs when ultraviolet light from the sun actually hits that cholesterol molecule and converts that modified cholesterol molecule into a vitamin D precursor. And then elsewhere in the body, that vitamin D precursor is converted into the active form of vitamin D itself. Now, vitamin D is a helpful vitamin in that it helps the digestive system absorb calcium from the foods that we consume. And the digestive system actually really struggles to absorb calcium from the foods that we consume when we're lacking in vitamin D. And so vitamin D is a very necessary vitamin in order for the digestive system to be able to absorb calcium from the foods that we eat. The skin also acts to activate certain steroid hormones, and one of the steroid hormones that it activates is a hormone that's called hydrocortisone. And so the skin actually has cortisone that's converted or serves to convert the hormone precursor cortisone into hydrocortisone, and hydrocortisone is an anti-inflammatory chemical agent in the body there. And so we've seen the skin not only acts to protect us, but it also serves some metabolic functions as well. The skin actually acts as a reservoir of blood, and the dermis, not the epidermis, right? Because remember, the epidermis is an epithelial tissue, but the dermis, being connective tissue, has blood vessels associated with it. And the dermis actually contains, the dermal blood vessels actually contain about 5% of the body's blood volume. And so therefore the dermis acts as a reservoir for blood when other body organs like skeletal muscles or things like that require greater volumes of blood during activity or during strenuous exercise or vigorous activity or things like that. So the dermis actually holds about 5% of our body's blood volume. And so in that way, it acts as a reservoir, and blood can be essentially shunted from the skin to other vital organs where it's needed at that time, right? Because we only have so much blood, and so that blood has to be rationed out accordingly. We also see that the skin serves in excretion, and so the skin works to eliminate some nitrogen-containing wastes by the process of excretion. So most of the nitrogen-containing wastes in our body are eliminated by our kidneys and our urinary system, but the skin eliminates small quantities of these as well. So small amounts of compounds called like urea, uric acid, and ammonia are lost through the skin. But most of these, as I mentioned, are lost through the urine.